Hello and welcome to the Brothers' War. Previously, we covered the Dred Scott decision, and this time we will cover in full the nominations, party activity, campaigning, and election of 1860. And just as a refresher, where we are right now, in 1858, Kansas has just bled, and the Dred Scott decision has been fully and completely decided with all that entails, but John Brown has not raided Harper's Ferry. He's still gathering accomplices and making plans in order to do so. So, to begin the story of the election of 1860, we have to start at the midterm election 2 years before, specifically the race for the one available Illinois Senate seat. The incumbent Democrat, Stephen Douglas, the champion of popular sovereignty, which has just recently been made unconstitutional, is being challenged by the country lawyer and former state legislator Abraham Lincoln, who I will forego biographical details on because he will be getting a full 15-minute minimum biographical episode later on. Now, Abraham Lincoln is at this point only anti-slavery, and has been very openly anti-slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. And right here in 1858, Lincoln has no intention of abolishing slavery. That's going to be very important in the future. Abraham Lincoln, before becoming president, does not want to abolish slavery. Don't forget that. But that's all in the future. We're focusing today on 1858, the contested Senate seat. In the lead up to the election, Lincoln and Douglas held a series of public debates, which was a first for American politics to hold public debates in the lead up to an election. These have been known in history as the LincolnDouglas Debates, where the small-town nobody Lincoln contested the little giant of Washington. Now, historians love the Lincoln-Douglas Debates because it very neatly draws the line between the two large groups of northern whites, Lincoln representing the one and Douglas representing the other. The beliefs are essentially reflections on the multifaceted slavery and race debate, as well as an evaluation of the division that debate has caused. Before the debate started, when Lincoln accepted the Republican Party nomination, he did so with his very famous House Divided address, selections of which read, "Mr. President and Gentlemen of the Convention. If we could first know where we are, and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed, because a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved, I don't expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward, till it have become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination, piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded of the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision. Let him consider not only what work the machinery is adapted to do, and how well adapted, but also let him study the history of its construction, and trace if he can, or rather fail if he can, to trace the evidences of design and concert of action among its chief bosses from the beginning." This speech was given before the debates, but it really enumerates Lincoln's position very well. He's against slavery, he's against the spread of slavery, he's worried about the spread of slavery, and he's also worried about slave power. Throughout the debates, he'll take the moral high ground, place his opposition to Douglas as an opposition to the spread of slavery, more specifically against Douglas's agnosticism on slavery. Because I'll remind you that Douglas is in favor of popular sovereignty always and always, rather than a firm stance for or against slavery. He really doesn't care. The way the debates were formatted was that one man would speak for an hour uninterrupted, and then the other man would give a rebuttal 90 minutes long, and then the guy who spoke first would conclude with a half-hour speech. Now that's a ton of time to be speaking uninterrupted. There was no cross-examination at all during these debates. But in the 1800s, people spoke a lot slower than they do today, and also were a bit more verbose in their word choice. What took Abraham Lincoln an hour to say could be rephrased and delivered today in maybe 20 minutes. At the debate in Jonesboro, Lincoln would say, quote, "When Douglas invites any people willing to have slavery to establish it, he's blowing out the moral lights around us. When he says he cares not whether slavery is voted down or voted up, saying that it is a sacred right of self-government, he is, in my judgment, penetrating the human soul and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty in this American people." Lincoln believed, and this is true all throughout his life, that republicanism, with a small r, commanded freedom, and that above the law and the Constitution there was some kind of spirit of America that compelled him to extend liberty and resist the spread of slavery. Douglas rebutted this in a frankly very weak manner in these debates, saying that Lincoln was in favor of racial equality, which was firmly outside the Overton window of the era and literally nobody believed in except for the occasional abolitionist, and that he was forcing the idea of black liberty upon the rest of the country. More effectively, he said that Lincoln was a disunionist, that he was an abolitionist, and that he was actively increasing the division that was ripping the country into a northern and southern half. Douglas's performance did not impress the electorate of Illinois, and Lincoln would win the election. But this is 1858. The 17th Amendment has not been passed yet, and senators are not elected by the people. They are elected by the state legislature, and the career Senator Douglas has many friends in the state legislature, and he managed to get the seat. The election of 1858, in general, not just in Illinois, resulted in a split in Congress, with the Democrats holding the Senate by majority and the Republicans holding the House by plurality. The following year, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, and the year after that, 2 years after Abraham Lincoln was propelled into the national lens by his debates with Douglas, it's the election of 1860. We finally made it to the election of 1860, what this episode is titled. The Democrats held their convention first, and immediately they're faced with the problem that the party has been split by Dred Scott into two major factions. The Northern Democrats, who are led by Douglas, are moderately opposed to it due to the ruling on popular sovereignty, and the Southern Democrats are firmly in favor of it due to the opening of all territories to the expansion of slavery and slave power. Also, within the Southern Democrats, we have a small, ultra-conservative group who are openly in favor of disunion, really with no qualifiers or conditions. They want out of the United States, because in the wake of John Brown's raid, the Northern Aggression conspiracy theory is at its absolute peak. This group, called the Fire Eaters, are absolutely convinced, despite the legal victories of Bleeding Kansas and the Dred Scott decision, that a forceful abolition of slavery is imminent, and that the only remedy to this was secession, peaceful or otherwise. The leader of the Fire Eaters is William Yancey, who has made his entire political career on the defense and spread of slavery. There's also a bit of a geographical divide within the Democrats. The Northern Democrats are really only popular in the Midwest. They're not really in New England at all. The average Southern Democrat are in the border states and in the Upper South, and the Fire Eaters have the Deep South firmly in their grasp. So when it comes time to nominate a candidate at the Charleston Convention in April 1860, the Northerners want Douglas. Who else? They're pretty confident he can snag Illinois, most of the Midwest, and the whole South. That's a winning combination, but Douglas was nominated before a platform was adopted. The party hasn't come into line yet. And so the Fire Eaters, who absolutely do not want Douglas, he's not a firm enough advocate of slavery, popular sovereignty isn't good enough, want an arch-conservative, pro-slavery man, and if we can't get that, how about we secede from the United States instead? The Northerners said, this is absurd. If you do that, you'll never win the border states, you can't win the Midwest, you might not even carry the whole South. Are you guys nuts? And the Fire Eaters kinda were nuts. The more moderate Southern Democrats wanted the incumbent Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. But by now, everyone is exhausted after several days of hour-long speeches, and the first of what would turn out to be 3 Democratic National Conventions ended without adopting a platform or a candidate. Seeing the contenders and very heated tensions among the Democrats, we turn to the Constitutional Union Party. Now, this is the brainchild of John Crittenden. He's a former Whig, and he's got a plan for a third party. Now, much like today, in 1860, third parties were not considered to have a chance at winning, but disrupting an election and throwing it into the House because no one has a majority of electoral votes. Now, that could happen. That was possible. It had happened a couple times. The hope was that if somebody who wasn't from one of the major parties could win the border states and one other major state, Pennsylvania maybe, or Virginia, they could contest the election and put it into the House where cooler heads could prevail. Crittenden didn't want to be the candidate, even though this was his idea, so he assembled a party out of old Whigs and know-nothings and formed his Constitutional Union Party. So called because everything you need to know about it is in the name of the party. They are for the Constitution and for the Union. That's it. The party never adopted a platform. It was founded on the, in retrospect, laughable conception that by ignoring the social division around the greatest question of the era, they may be able somehow to solve that greatest question of the era. Now, it's time to choose a candidate, and if we can assume that Jefferson Davis will eventually get the Democratic nomination, and making an educated guess that William Seward will win the Republican nomination, both men very well-established candidates, we need someone of high caliber, someone major, and the only two men who are up to this are John Bell, a senator from Tennessee, and Samuel Houston, the governor of Texas. Sam Houston was a character, a very famous guy, war hero, former Democrat. He would do well in the South, but the Texan would have very little appeal in the North. Bell was a moderate on every issue, and from the upper southern state Tennessee, he could definitely also win Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. This plan totally relies on carrying the border states, the western states, and the upper south. The general-in-chief, Winfield Scott, was considered, but he was considered a losing candidate as well. He lost the presidential race in '52, but Bell was the single most moderate man in the party dedicated to moderation. He ended up winning the nomination. And Edward Everett was selected, somewhat unwillingly, as his vice president, and so he's from Massachusetts. So, if Davis wins the South and Seward wins the North, then Bell can win the Upper South and their home states of Tennessee and Massachusetts, and then any one of Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Virginia. That would be enough to throw the election. The Democrats, after this nomination, have finished their break and they meet again in early May. Once again, the Northerners are firmly of the opinion Douglas or nobody, and the fire eaters are out eating fire and openly threatening secession. When they all finally sit down and start voting, once it becomes clear that Douglas will win the nomination before the votes have finally been tallied, the fire eaters stood up and departed the convention hall. All of the Deep South and most of the Upper South up and left with no opposition. So, in light of this all, Stephen Douglas was nominated to be President of the United States, and maybe a third of the party supported him in doing so. Now we've got the Republicans. Meeting in mid-May, 2 weeks after the DNC and just a few days after Bell got the nomination, every political observer and most of the Republicans themselves are firmly of the opinion that Senator William Seward was going to be the nominee. He wasn't an abolitionist, so we're avoiding the pitfall of 1856, so more moderate than Fremont, but still a principled anti-slavery man, as we have seen. He's really a natural choice. Even though he had made some private remarks in favor of racial inequality that had alienated the abolitionists within the party. While Seward was favored by a majority of Republicans, there was also Salmon Chase, the governor of Ohio. He's an incredibly honest and capable man, and he can appeal to the Westerners. Within the Republican Party, there's a left-right axis, as within all other parties and politics in general. Seward and Chase are both center-left, Chase a bit to the left of Seward. There are also a plethora of candidates from all around the political spectrum that have been nominated as well. Simon Cameron, right in the center, a former Democrat and know-nothing, he could thwart the Constitutional Union Party's efforts to throw the election. The old war hero Edward Bates was a good candidate from the right, and being from Missouri, he could do well in the border states. He was briefly considered by the Constitutional Union Party as well. Ben Wade would be considered left-wing as an abolitionist, women's rights, and racial equality candidate. And lastly, definitely lastly, we have Abraham Lincoln, who was really only considered at all because he was still something of a celebrity after his debates with Douglas. The 6'4", 180-pound country lawyer, while a native of Illinois, was born in Kentucky, and with his reputation as a great orator and campaigner, an incredibly inoffensive man in general, always greeting strangers with a howdy and a handshake with both hands, he was probably the candidate with the best chance at winning the Upper South. Southern Illinois is basically the Upper South. And he definitely was the only candidate people knew for a fact could win Illinois from Douglas. As the convention began in Chicago at the Wigwam, as the building where it was held was known, Lincoln's everyman bearing and oratorical skills won him a standing ovation in his very first speech. The party adopted a platform that was for economic growth based on free soil principles, as well as a series of tariffs on foreign trade. It took only 2 days for numerous speeches to be given and the platform to be adopted. The convention was running so smoothly that when they proceeded to go ahead with voting for presidential nominee, the convention staff had to call the day's activities to a premature halt because they hadn't even printed the ballots yet, which left the afternoon and evening for Lincoln and his campaign manager David Davis to do some campaign work. Now, Lincoln was a very popular second or third choice, but he was really nobody's first choice, and he and his manager knew this. So Davis and an accomplice from Indiana went around that evening and night and tried to disillusion people to their first choices. Seward and Chase, too radical. They'll lose Pennsylvania and Illinois. Bates, too conservative. He'll never win over the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Cameron, nobody knows who he is. He won't win outside of Pennsylvania. Lincoln, now he's a former Whig. He's in favor of the new tariffs. He can win in the Upper South. Wouldn't that be a thing? The next morning, the third day of the convention, after all the deals had been struck, the party convened. There were 466 delegates in attendance, and a man, and they were all men, needed 233 of those to clinch the nomination. The first vote came in with a tally of 173.5 for Seward, 102 for Lincoln, Cameron 50.5, Chase 49, Bates 48. Needing a second ballot, the second round took place between Lincoln, Seward, and Chase primarily. The tally came in for round 2, 184.5 for Seward, 181 Lincoln, and Chase 42, and change for the others. It would go on to a third round. The wigwam was tense as the final votes were counted. Remember, 233 to win, and round 3 went 180 Seward, 231.5 for Lincoln, and change for the other men. After the vote was tallied, David Carter, representing Ohio, announced that 4 of the votes from Ohio would be shifted from Chase to Lincoln, giving Lincoln, everybody's second choice, 234 votes, one more than was necessary to become the nominee. And the wigwam went nuts celebrating, and shortly thereafter nominated Hannibal Hamlin to vice presidency. Being from Kentucky, the choice of a Southerner was deemed a good idea. The celebratory cannons were fired both indoors and out. Back to the Democrats, now meeting in Baltimore. They're trying to hash out a platform and candidates, and it's a royal mess. The Southerners aren't having it. Some appointed multiple delegations, with moderates right out refusing to vote, the fire eaters eating fire, deals made, deals broken, late-night dinners, failed compromises, raised tempers, and verbal sparring nearly becoming real duels. After 5 long days in June, compared to the Republicans' 3 days altogether, the pro-popular sovereignty platform was adopted, and Douglas was nominated again at one convention, and at another convention across town, a pro-slavery platform was adopted, and one John Breckinridge, the incumbent vice president, was nominated. So, the 1860 presidential election is now a 4-way struggle for the executive, and it really serves as a litmus test for the 4 predominating political trends within the U.S. at this time. Popular sovereignty from Douglas, free soil from Lincoln, pro-slavery with a hint of secession from Breckinridge, and Southern Unionism from Bell. Really consisting of 2 smaller elections, one for the North and one for the South, the Northern race is Douglas versus Lincoln, just like 58, but on the national scale. The issues are essentially where you stand on slavery, whether you are opposed to it or whether you are more neutral to it. In the South, Bell versus Breckinridge, it reflects whether you are in favor of it or more neutral to it. Unlike today, presidential campaigns were relatively bottom-up rather than top-down affairs. The respective candidates never saw each other face-to-face, and Lincoln only gave one speech in the entire duration. Must have been a good one. There was a very peculiar social movement going around young men in the North called the Wide Awake movement. Now, the Wide Awakes were a frankly weird social trend in the North where men in their late teens and early 20s would hold nighttime torch rallies in the now open, now secret society with lamps and open eyes festooned on oilskin overcoats, featuring log cabins on wheels pulled by oxen and building split-rail fences around town, as well as the more orthodox campaign work spreading leaflets and pamphlets around town for Lincoln and the Republicans. I guess you just had to be there. In the South, it was more clear-cut. Years and years of the Northern aggression conspiracy theory and John Brown's raid, not to mention being scared to death of all these weirdo wide-awakes, meant opposition as a unified voting bloc against Lincoln at absolutely all costs, to such an extent that Lincoln was not even on the ballot in 10 southern states. The Constitutional Union Party went with traditional Whiggish moderation, and met their audience where they were in the border states and the Upper South. The Deep South was left entirely to Breckinridge. The 4 men crisscrossed the country, stumping, rallying, and fundraising and preaching their respective doctrines until November 3rd came around and the votes were counted. The turnout was estimated to be 81%, of white male citizens, that is. In the legislature, it was exactly what it was before. Democrats hold the Senate, Republicans hold the House. But for the president, in the popular vote, last among our 4, John Bell got 590,000 votes, 12%. John Breckinridge got 848,000, 18%. Stephen Douglas got 1,380,000, 29%. And Abraham Lincoln got 1,865,000, 40%. Lincoln has a plurality. It looks like the Constitutional Union Party are going to get what they want. They're going to throw it to the House. But when the electoral votes were counted, out of 303 total and 152 electoral votes to win, Douglas, though second overall, comes in last with 12. Bell gets bumped up to third with 39, Breckinridge to second with 72, and Abraham Lincoln wins the race with 180 electoral votes out of 152 to win, a clear majority. Hail to the chief. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a like. If you didn't, a dislike. In the comments, you can leave suggestions for special episodes, questions for the Q&A, and whatever else you'd like to put there. Please be sure to share this video with a history buff in your life, and I'll see you next time, where the South Carolina legislature, a month after the election, will publish the following statement. We, the people of the state of South Carolina, in convention assembled do declare and ordain that the ordinance adopted by us in convention on the 23rd day of May in the year of our Lord 1788, whereby the Constitution of the United States of America was ratified, and also all acts and parts of acts of the General Assembly of the state ratifying amendments of the said Constitution are hereby repealed, and that the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved.